When looking into drawing aspects from Harold Shipman's life, I first decided to draw a portrait of him, which again I decided to look at several different reference photos just to fully capture all of the features on his face. I first started off with the basic outline of his face, and he didn't necessarily have a defined jawline, but he didn't have a very round face. It was sort of a somewhat defined jawline, so I decided to just draw a basic jawline for him. And then following this, I decided to draw his eyes, which, when looking at photos, they were quite small in comparison to the rest of his face. So I decided to emphasise the fact that they are small, and I decided to just have them as semicircles with small pupils in the middle. And then he also had hooded eyes, so I decided to add lines above them just to give him a deeper set eye, because the line acts as a top lid. And then from this I decided to give him bushy eyebrows, which I just represented by adding several hair strokes, and then layered them just to make them appear thicker and bushier, because when looking at the reference photos I had spotted that he does actually have quite thick bushy eyebrows. And then from there I decided to draw his glasses, which I just decided to represent just as the most simplistic form that I could, so just the frames and then the two eyepieces. And then I'd also spotted that his nose is also quite round, so because I was wanting to do it in a cartoon style, I decided to, rather than draw his nose more realistically, I decided to just draw a slightly squished circle, and then just represented that as the nose, because I'd remembered from my previous drawings when I drew art foundation students, I had often represented their noses by either presenting them as circles or ovals, because I'd observed that within a lot of cartoons, like different cartoonists do that also. And then obviously when looking at the photographs, to me one of the main aspects of his appearance is his white moustache and beard, which covered the majority of his mouth, which was quite difficult to deal with initially, but then I thought, well, if I draw the mouth shape, which from what I had observed it was just quite a thin line, so I represented his mouth in that way. And then from that I then added the moustache and the beard, which was represented by cross-hatching along his jaw and his chin, as well as his upper lip. And then I'd also observed that he has several quite faint wrinkle marks on his forehead, so obviously I represented those by adding slightly curved lines that I then repeated just to emphasise the fact that he has wrinkles on his forehead. And then with the hair, this was admittedly quite challenging because I'm not really used to drawing people with receding hairlines. I decided to look at the picture and then think, how could I represent the receding hairline in a simplistic but also identifiable way? And I came to the conclusion that it was easiest just to draw the outline of his head from the part in which it started to recede, and then just add hair-like strokes from the head going outwards, just to create the appearance that his hairline is receding, and I feel that definitely worked. So next I decided to draw Kathleen Grundy, which is his very last victim, which ultimately led him to being convicted, because when she died, within her will, the majority of the money was requested to have been sent to Harold Shipman when she had died, as well as the fact that when Harold Shipman had visited her just to give her... Harold Shipman had originally only supposed to have been visiting her to give her a blood test, because she'd recently recovered from cancer. And so the fact that when Howard Shipman had visited her, even though she was perfectly healthy, she died and then all of a sudden left a large amount of money to him. Kathleen Grundy's daughter, who was a lawyer, inspected the papers and then found that the cause of death was a morphine overdose. This led to Shipman being discovered as a murderer. So I decided to draw her by finding a reference photo, and I did manage to find one, thankfully. And then from this I found that she was also quite stereotypical of an elderly woman. So, for example, she has really deep set smile lines, and so I represented those by adding 2 lines either side of her mouth. And then she also had really thin eyebrows, so I represented those by just adding really small, light hair strokes. And then she also had curly hair, so in turn I represented those by just adding simplistic curled shapes repeatedly around her head just to represent the curled hair. And then in terms of her eyes, I decided to represent those as crosses, because obviously she died at the hands of Harold Shipman, and in a lot of cartoons, when a character dies, they are represented to have crosses over their eyes, just to show that there isn't life behind the eyes anymore. And as I've said before, I had represented that also with the Mary Hogan drawing, which I did for my Ed Gein research. Then next, as Harold Shipman's method of execution was morphine, I decided to turn that into a character just to show the significance of the morphine and also the impact that it had on him as a child. So the reason that it's so significant for Shipman is because he was introduced to a doctor who would regularly visit and give shots of morphine to his mother, who was very ill. And so he would regularly see her in pain, but then at the hands of the doctor she would immediately be And at the hands of the doctor, his mother's pain would just fade away, which sort of acts like the doctor is some sort of godlike figure that can either choose if a person is in pain. Shortly after, despite having many morphine injections, his mother, Vera, passed away. And so, because this was in the 1960s, there was, and although there still is, but even more so in the 1960s, there was a stigma towards discussing grief publicly, especially as a male. And so his mother's death was never mentioned, which obviously caused him to suppress his grief. And there's another aspect in terms of her death where on the night of her death, Shipman sprinted for miles and miles, which possibly resulted in a very large amount of endorphins being produced, and perhaps that formed some sort of positive association with death. That when Shipman was killing people, obviously morphine was his execution of choice, and so he would obviously write that their cause of death was due to natural causes when in fact he was using morphine. It's also perhaps argued that Shipman's specific choice of execution was chosen from the memories that he had with his mother, obviously seeing her repeatedly being injected with morphine. It is argued that perhaps when using the morphine on other patients, he would see his mother and almost relive her death every time that he killed someone, because obviously losing a parent is such a traumatic and horrible experience, let alone suppressing it and never talking about it. And so obviously this symbol behind morphine could perhaps be Shipman's way of externalizing his grief. Finally, I decided to draw a book, which again, I decided to turn it into a character because obviously I feel like if I just drew a book it would be quite boring, whereas if I turned it into a character it would be something that was more appropriate for children, and obviously that is the main basis around my whole concept. So obviously I decided to draw the basic shape of a book and then add small scribbles inside of the book just to act as text, just to even further clarify that it is in fact a book. And then I decided to add glasses because to me I feel that people who read books are often stereotyped as being quite nerdy, and then obviously when you think of a nerd you immediately go to glasses, and so I incorporated both of those stereotypes with this character. And the reason I specifically decided to draw a book is because Shipman's mother, whilst he was at school, she increasingly pushed him to be extremely ambitious to the point where he didn't have any friends and he didn't go out after school, and he just constantly revised and did homework. So he had an abnormally strong work ethic, which ultimately led him into his career of being a doctor.